Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are doing another part of the series, Fact to Film, focusing specifically on Anneliese Michel, who inspired the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. The Exorcism of Emily Rose came out in 2005, but was inspired by events that happened in Germany in 1975. The movie is based around a girl named Emily Rose who starts to experience delusions, has seizures, and is diagnosed as epileptic. She starts taking her medicine, but sees no real change, and instead she starts having really vivid hallucinations. She starts to hear voices, and she believes she starts seeing the face of the devil. After medication and doctors don't seem to be helping, Emily Rose and her parents agree that she might actually have a demon inside of her and need to be exorcised. They seek help from the Catholic Church and perform an exorcism, which does result in the death of Emily Rose. The priest is arrested for negligent homicide, and the movie is actually set inside the courtroom as his lawyer has to fight that he was working under his best intentions to try to save Emily Rose. Now, while some of the movie is a little bit overproduced and the story is adjusted to make it acceptable for film, the premise and the idea behind it is very real. Anneliese Michel was born in Germany on September 21st, 1952. She was raised in a very religious household, was a devout Catholic, and went to Mass twice a week. Her family started noticing that she wasn't showing up to school sometimes. She would wander around by herself and always have a blank expression, as though she was in a trance. Anneliese would say that she'd have no recollection of these trance-like states once she popped out of them, not really remembering what happened or what she did. She was taken to the doctor and diagnosed with psychoses caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, basically saying that she was having seizures and these sort of fits due to an issue in her frontal lobe. Anneliese was taking medications for this, but her symptoms only seemed to get worse. She eventually became depressed, started harming herself, and was labeled as suicidal. Her parents put her into a psychiatric ward so she could be under intensive care to try to help figure out more of what was happening inside of her. For the next 5 years, Anneliese Michel was put on multiple medications, seen by multiple doctors, and there was still no definitive cause for what she was experiencing. And her symptoms only seemed to be getting worse, even with medicine and doctor help. Anneliese started saying that she was hearing voices in her head telling her that she was damned to go to hell whenever she was praying. And she started saying that she was seeing this face of Satan throughout her day-to-day life. By the time Anneliese was 20 years old, she was totally intolerant to all religious artifacts and couldn't even step inside of her own church anymore. She's reported as actually telling one of the priests that she could get no further than the garden in the church before she would have an overwhelming feeling that she wasn't supposed to be there and wasn't allowed in. She would try multiple times to allow herself into the church, but found that even the imagery outside the church, the stained glass windows that would show bishops, angels, and even one that showed Jesus, were so repulsive to her that she couldn't bring herself to step inside. By this time, the visions and voices are in full force, and Anneliese Michel, while still praying frequently, was hearing these voices to the point where she was convinced that she herself was possessed. As her psychosis state increased, Anneliese started doing things that were considered extremely abnormal even for patients suffering with epilepsy and seizures. Anneliese was still conflicting self-harm on herself, but it had escalated to her drinking her own urine. She bit a head off of a bird, and she resulted into eating insects. And while things like that are common in patients who are having a psychotic break, her parents didn't believe that that was the root cause. And after discussing it with Anneliese, they decided that an exorcism was the way to go. And in real-life terms, whenever an exorcism is going to be performed, the priests have to present the bishops with the case and show that the patient has received as much medical treatment as necessary and that there was still no results. And after 5 years of being on medication and being in and out of psych wards, Anneliese and her parents believed that she herself had done everything that they could medical-wise, and it was time to turn to religion. As I said, it took almost a year for Anneliese's case to get accepted by the bishop and to be given permission to perform the exorcism. And on September 24th, 1975, the first exorcism of Anneliese Michel was performed. Priest Ernest Alt was the head priest in charge of the exorcism and is the one that did most of the work. And after seeing Anneliese's behavior during the exorcism, her parents fully believed that a demon was inside of their daughter, and at that point they stopped seeking medical help. Now, from what I've read, Anneliese did take her medications all the way up until the time of her death, but she stopped going to doctors. For the next year of her life, 67 exorcisms were performed. After the first one, Anneliese stopped eating and drinking, and by the time of her death in July 1st, 1976, she weighed only 67 pounds and was considered extremely malnourished and dehydrated, which was the result of her death. Anneliese Michel died at the age of 23, and both her parents and the two priests who were involved in the exorcism were taken to court for negligent homicide, and the trial began as whether or not her parents and the priest had neglected Anneliese, not letting her go to the doctor for the last year of her life, and thus resulted in her death. In the end, the parents and the priest were convicted as guilty for negligent homicide, but the sentence was only for 6 months, which was later reduced to just a fine. The parents did not have to pay a fine or go to jail, as their lawyer argued that they had suffered enough with the loss of their daughter and seeing her deteriorate over the past year that their price had been paid. And in the movie An Exorcism of Emily Rose, the priest does end up being convicted as guilty, but the jury states that he has suffered enough of the things that he had to see that he had served his time. Anneliese's case became huge news during the time, and there were two sides to the coin. There are the people who believed in things such as demons and the devil and the ability for a demon to possess a human soul, and that this was just reassurance of that happening. While there are other people who said that this is a case of religion over medicine that resulted in the death of a young woman. Anneliese Michel died at 23 years old, and as I said, she only weighed 67 pounds at the time of her death. But the biggest thing that was argued during the court case was the fact that Anneliese Michel chose to do this for herself. She chose to reach out to the priest about the exorcism, and she chose to stop seeing medical advice along with her parents' support. Anneliese Michel did take her medication up until the time of her death, which was something argued in court as well, that Anneliese Michel, although she stopped going to see the doctors, didn't necessarily stop taking the medical advice that they had given her. She just simply believed that the medicine was doing nothing, as her symptoms hadn't gotten any better over the past 5 years, and that the exorcism was truly her last chance. And one of the most surprising things about this case is the fact that there was actual audio evidence of these exorcisms happening. The audio is over an hour long. I'm not going to play it here just because of copyright issues, but I'm going to leave a link in the description so you guys can go and listen to it. And the audio is a little bit disturbing. There are points when you hear Anneliese speaking in her normal voice, and then there are times during the exorcism where she's speaking in the tongues of the 6 demons that she claimed were inside of her. And the demons that were claimed to be inside of Anneliese Michel was Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Adolf Hitler, Nero, and Fleischmann. And we can hear Anneliese speaking in the different tongues of these 6 different demons throughout the audio, and she even herself says the 6 demons that are inside of her. And the audio is disturbing to people who listen to it, especially people who heard audio of Anneliese in her normal speaking voice, as she reaches octaves and makes noises, which are quite disturbing as a young female to be able to do. That doesn't mean that it's not possible, as obviously voice acting is a huge thing, and being able to alter your voice to sound like different people is a talent people have. It was something, though, that Anneliese Michel had never explicitly done before, and that didn't start occurring until the exorcisms started happening. There are photos of Anneliese Michel during the exorcism being held down by her mother that show just the deteriorating states of Anneliese herself. At the time of her death, both of her knees were severely broken and the tendons completely torn apart. Anneliese Michel insisted on consistently praying throughout the exorcisms, doing it upwards of 10 times a day, and every single time getting down to her knees to do it. So her body was slowly deteriorating, and she was constantly up and down on her knees, which caused so much tearing in the tendons and eventually caused the bones to break. And there is a photo of Anneliese being helped down to her knees by her mother, because even her parents were so desperate that they were willing to do anything Anneliese and the priest believed was going to help. And a lot of times the exorcisms are still supposed to be performed under the supervision of a medical professional as well, to help in case something goes terribly wrong and a medical professional is needed. I don't know for sure if a medical professional was on site during Anneliese Michel's exorcism, but the church believed that they were doing everything that was right in the case of her and her family by bypassing medical help, keeping her on her medication, but then performing these exorcisms. The family and the priest both didn't want her to stop eating. It wasn't that they weren't trying to help her or trying to force her, they simply couldn't get her to eat or drink anything. And she would go through phases where she'd be kind of okay and was able to eat and drink. And I think she would go days, if not a few weeks, with barely eating or drinking anything. Which is why whenever she died, people were outraged, saying that even if she had been taken to a hospital a week before her death, she could have been saved by being put on IVs and sent to intensive care. While her parents and the priest believed that they did everything in their power to save Anneliese Michel, her death was still very tragic and was kind of big news at the time. It wasn't until 2005 that someone made a movie directly based off of her story, just changing a few details and kind of sprucing it up for Hollywood. But that's the movie that you get when you watch The Exorcism of Emily Rose. And while that movie is a little bit more tamed compared to the Exorcism movie, it's still horribly terrifying to know that what you're watching is based off of true events. It's a great demon movie and one that I would suggest you guys watch. It's a classic for anyone who loves a good demonic possession. But the important thing is to not forget the events behind the film, The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, which ended up resulting in her tragic, untimely death. Demonic possession is something we've seen cross-culturally throughout hundreds of years. It is not a new concept, but the 1975 exorcisms of Anneliese Michel did sort of spark a new interest in exorcisms and their effectiveness against patients who might be suffering from something more mentally. But I'm curious to see what you guys think. Do you believe in demonic possessions in general? Do you believe that Anneliese Michel was possessed? Or do you think Anneliese Michel, being devoutly religious, knew about possessions and exorcisms, and in her deteriorating mental state, thought that that was the best way to go for her? You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'll be making a post about this video as well. But I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos. I put out new videos every Friday. And until next time, stay spooky.